Good morning. I'm Wayne Dalston, the SGSM president. Welcome to our January quarterly hybrid program at the Minnesota Genealogy Center. We have book sales today, so for those of you that are here and those that you wish you were here, you can do that after the program. Are there any first-time attendees here in the room? Okay, we have one. Welcome, welcome.
I'm first time.
And what is your name?
Susan Summers.
Okay, welcome to you. Anybody else on Zoom?
Yeah, my name's Scott Morgan.
Okay, thank you.
And Denise Bro.
Diane Okoski.
Joel Gerdine.
Okay, any other first-time attendees? Okay, and we didn't ask you for your name. Can you give us your name too? Mia's here. Okay, Mia's here in the room. She's shy, but she's here. Okay, so now, for Zoom participants, make sure your computers are on mute and turn off your video during the presentation. That helps bandwidth overall. Kurt Carlson will be monitoring your chat questions, and we thank Kurt for his mastering of hybrid meetings. And he's become so famous within the genealogy world of Minnesota that other societies are asking him, how do you do that? And can you help us? So, you know, fame has its price, Kurt. And so he's going to monitor the chat questions for the Zoom audience. And the presenters will answer your questions at the end of their presentation. So they've requested you hold your questions until the end. And when we get to that point, for those of you in the room, you can raise your hand and we'll bring you a microphone that you can ask your questions directly. And now here is, again, outgoing program chair, Liz Williams-Gamal.
Thank you. I'm back. We have two experts with us today who will enlighten us about what the Viking warriors thought about life, death, and the afterlife. I don't know where else you could possibly learn about this. So is that not a cool topic or what? We have Dr. William Short. He was awarded a Doctor of Science degree from MIT and spent many years in research in fields related to acoustics and audio, including something to do with the Bose radio, which I have at home. He received dozens of patents, and he shares the Intellectual Property Owners Education Foundation Inventor of the Year Award for 1987. After reading several sagas and taking summer courses at the University of Iceland, Dr. Short pivoted to a full-time study of Viking-related topics, focusing on combat. He's the manager of the New England-based organization Hurstwick and leads their research. Dr. Short was a research fellow at Higgins Armory Museum, and he is co-author with Reynir Óskarson of Men of Terror, a comprehensive analysis of Viking combat, and author of several other books on Viking topics. Our other presenter is Reynir Óskarson, and he grew up in Iceland, a land steeped in Viking history where sagas are required reading in school. Starting at an early age, Reynir received extensive martial arts training in many forms of combat, so you didn't want to make him upset with you. He holds instructor's degrees in a number of combative arts, and he has been teaching, giving seminars, and competing both domestically and abroad. Reynir's research in Glima, the Viking Age empty-hand combat that evolved into Iceland's national sport, has received accolades from current and past chairmen and champions at the Wrestling Association of Iceland. And so with that, we turn it over to our presenters. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. I'm going to start by attempting to share my screen and see if I can make this work. Good. So first of all, thank you to the entire group for inviting us to speak. We're honored to be here. I'm Dr. William Short, and with me today is Reynir Óskarson. And we are part of Hurstwick, which is a group that scientifically researches Vikings with a focus on Viking combat. And today we're going to use the word Viking very generically to mean any of the northern people, so primarily Scandinavia, during the early medieval period, about 1,000 years ago. Now, it's very hard to fit us into a category. We've been using both conventional and unconventional approaches to researching Vikings for more than 20 years. We've been dispelling myths in many areas of Viking research using these methods. And there's even a special exhibit now at the National Museum of Iceland based on our myth busting. Now, Herstvik's 20 years of research on Vikings has been summarized in a new book, Men of Terror. And the book takes its name from this memorial stone. It was raised in memory of a man named Freyja, who died in Sweden. And on the stone, he is called the first among Vikings and a terror of men. And so much of what we'll talk about today is illustrated by this stone and the message on it. So we'll be coming back to it numerous times as we talk about the Viking Age beliefs in the afterlife. And now I'm going to turn it over to Reynir. And as you will see, we will be going back and forth, passing the baton multiple times today.
Yeah, so William gave you a quick peek into who we are and what this lecture will be about. But I am going to give you more of what we are not. So we consider ourselves scientists. My sister thinks we're Viking perverts because of our fascination with the Viking Age. But as you could see in the image, these two handsome devils, they're not Vikings. We are not neo-Vikings, we're not modern Vikings. And even though we're old, we are not 1,000-year-old men. We are not, in fact, real Vikings. And that is really important for us for a multitude of reasons, mostly because we don't want to paint the past with the colors of the present. These are different people than we are today. So for the duration of this lecture, please note that none of you are Vikings. Just bear with me. They had different custom, culture, laws, upbringing. It was a different society. And just to show you the difference, what we think is, what we cherish or love and think is norm, Vikings might have thought was horrible. What we think is horrible, Vikings might have thought was just a normal thing. For example, að bera út, to take unwanted children, carry them out and leave them to the elements to die, to put them to death, or slavery for that matter. And this goes as well with what we will talk about today, the beliefs, the ideas about death, the ideas about the afterlife. They were different. So let's leave our preconceived ideas to the side. Now, our main focus is Viking combat and what a Viking warrior thought about death, about the afterlife and his beliefs. They told us a lot what he would do in combat. So what you think is what you will do. Mindset dictates behavior, what you will or won't do in battle. So I really ask you to leave your preconceived ideas, your modern mindset, and so on, and biases alone for a moment. Remember, we are not Vikings, at least not in this lecture for now. So, William.
Okay. So before we explain our thoughts on life and death and the afterlife, let's talk a little bit about how we know what it is we know. In other words, what sources do we use? And importantly, how do we interpret those sources? Every source, whether it's like an archaeological find or a literary manuscript or anything like that, needs to be interpreted and put in context to be meaningful. And so as we do our research, we have to be really careful about our interpretation to avoid errors and to avoid biases. So here's some of the sources we use. One source that we use is literary sources, and notably the two Eddas that contain virtually all the mythology of the Viking Age. And the first of those two is called the Poetic Edda. It's a carefully collected and arranged series of poems, and they are about the old gods, the old legends, the old heroes, and they teach us about the myths, the stories that form the basis of Viking Age beliefs, the stories that teach us about the preferred way to behave, how to live, how to die, what was admired and what was reviled. And they teach us what life held for a Viking. And this manuscript here is pretty much the only surviving, it is the only surviving copy for the vast majority of these poems. And it was written down sometime in the middle of the 13th century. Yet the poems are clearly ancient. And even in the Viking age, these poems were thought to be ancient. Now, the second Edda we use is the prose Edda, also known as the Snorra Edda. It is a textbook of poetry written by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century. And in the book, he relays many of the myths in prose to explain and teach the ancient poetry. Yet many of the myths about the gods and the afterlife would be lost or confused without this Edda, because his prose explains and amplifies what the myths that are described in the poetry. So without it, much of these myths would be hard to understand or impossible to understand. But as with any source related to the Vikings, we have to be careful about interpretation. So for instance, in this particular case, some of the material in the book may have been altered to fit Snorri's worldview as a Christian. Now, together, these two Eddas form the basis of our understanding of the myths and the beliefs of the Vikings, but we learn from other literary sources as well. So for instance, the sagas, which tell us about death, life, afterlife, myths, beliefs, and so much more. We look at the law codes that tell us how the dead should be treated. We look at other literary sources, histories, genealogies, and so on. And importantly, we look at literary sources from other lands outside the Viking lands, such as the Anglo-Saxons, the Franks, even the Moors. These are people who interacted with the Vikings and often were adversarial with the Vikings, but their writings give us a different point of view than those of the Vikings, how the Vikings dealt with danger and imminent death. So they're an important source. Now, we also have writings on rune stones and memorial stones, and these were a very important source to us because they're contemporary with the Vikings. These are words written by Vikings for Vikings, and so they are an invaluable source. And in remembering a person after their death, these words teach us about the Viking views on death. We also have graffiti left by Vikings as they traveled around the known world, runic scribblings, created by Vikings during their travels. And these reveal the Viking desire to have their names remembered. We use pictorial sources, for example, pictures on picture stones. And these are often pictures from the myths, showing a single episode from the myth. Here, this particular stone tells the story or shows the story of Thor fishing for the world serpent. And typically these pictures illustrate one moment of the myth. And this stone illustrates the moment where Thor pulls on the line so hard that his foot goes through the bottom of the boat. And this story is shown on picture stones all across the Viking lands, from England to Sweden, and from many, many centuries, from before the Viking Age until after the Viking Age, this story is represented on picture stones. So it tells us about the love for this story and how this story was told and retold over many, many centuries and many lands. Another source we use is the archaeology of graves. And this tells us about burial practices. And we'll talk about grave goods, items that were left in the graves. And so the grave goods that we find in these graves teach us about something about the afterlife. So for instance, this person was buried with a comb prominently placed on their body. We'll talk a lot more about this later. So these are the main sources we use. And there are others that are important to us, but these are the main ones, and all of them are difficult to interpret. And I'd like to give you just one example of that. There's a small silver figure that has been found, and many people think it represents a Valkyrie, these women who escorted the slain warriors to Valhalla. Is it that, or could it be something else? Many interpretations are possible, and we simply cannot be certain. And it's a mistake to make assumptions. Reynir, did I miss something?
No, you're doing pretty damn well. So I'll continue on from there. These are the sources, but how do we do research? How do we put these sources together to form any understanding? And my main thought is always, let's take our biases out, our modern mindset out. And we do research in a special way, and I will give you an analogy by something that we cannot have any biases about. So suppose we saw a UFO crash in the desert. It's fragmented, most of it is just destroyed, but we want to reverse engineer it. We want to know how it flies. We want to use the ray gun or the tractor beam or what have you. Now, we cannot do that by only taking the hyperdrive, one part, and try to reverse engineer from there. We can't do it with the fragments we have. So one source is incomplete. So we would have to interview people who have been abducted. What did they see inside the ship? How did it move? What can it tell us? We would have to look at old grainy images of UFOs or videos of lights in the sky. We need every single source. And what we do is we layer them together. We put one source on top of another source on top of another source. And they all should show the same image. They should all point in the same direction. Now, if a source or an episode in a source or a single source points in a different way, we need to stop and think, why? Now, it could be an item that's misinterpreted. That happens all the time. Even we at Hörstöka found archaeological items that were misinterpreted. It's nothing terrible, and or it could be just an outlier. Now, everything points in the same direction, but there's one artifact or one episode or something that points in another direction. We do not look there. We are not looking for outliers. What we're looking for is the holistic image, the common thread, be that via Viking combat or their beliefs in the afterlife and death and so on. So it's the big picture we want. So what do the sources tell us? What happens after death? And I will compare it to Western society, because in the Western society, it is simple. The doctor will determine if you're dead or not. It's a clear-cut thing. It's either black or white. You're dead or you're alive. And if you're a Christian, your spirit leaves the body and goes to heaven or hell, depending on if you were a bastard in this life or not. And if you're an atheist, the same thing will happen, except the spirit doesn't go out because it doesn't exist and it has no place to go to. In the Viking Age, it was different. Life and death were a really gray area. And separation of body and spirit, again, that is not easy to decipher. Am I missing something, William?
No, sounds good.
I'll let you take over.
Yeah, so something that we'll come back to again and again is how gray this area is between life and death for the Viking people. So what I'd like to do is start with the aspect that we probably know more about, and that is what happens to the body after death. You know, what were the burial practices of the Vikings? Now, during the Viking Age, most people were heathens. Their burial practices differed from those of Christians. So we'll talk about the heathen practices first. And the details varied from time to time during the Viking Age and also from place to place. But most commonly, the bodies were buried. They were placed in a shallow grave and covered with a mound. And this is a grave that was excavated in North Iceland. And the body was placed in the shallow grave along with the dog and the horse, and the whole thing covered over with a mound of stones and dirt. Some of the mounds were enormous. So this is another Icelandic grave. It's huge. Some bodies were buried in boats or ships, such as this Royal Óskarson burial. Clearly the body of a very high status woman was buried in the ship. Now, in some places and in some times, the body was burned. For example, cremation is much more common in the trading town of Berka than in other lands and other times. But the cremation was probably not as fanciful as described in some modern or popular sources. Now, one significant aspect of heathen graves is the presence of grave goods. You know, people were buried with the things they used in everyday life. For instance, Eyjolf's saga tells us that Eyjolf's father, Skáldagripur, was buried with his horse, his weapons, and his blacksmithing tools. This man was buried with his weapons. So, for instance, on his right side is his axe, his spear, and his sword, and on his right side, his sax, his short sword, and his torso was covered over with his shield. All the wooden parts of the shield have rotted away, and all that's left is the iron boss. This woman was buried with her needle case that carried her sewing needles, some cosmetic items, and a couple of shells which probably held cosmetics. And children would be buried with toys or a favorite doll. People were buried with the things that they used every day, perhaps so they could continue to use them after death. You know, some of the grave goods suggest that the dead person was about to go on a journey, and a good example of that is the Óskarson burial. In the burial was the ship, a boat, a wagon, a tent, cooking gear, beds, and the list goes on and on and on. And even the saga evidence sometimes suggests that people were going on a journey. In Gisla saga, Gisli was burying his brother-in-law, and Gisli tied on hell shoes, hellskor, to his brother-in-law's feet in the grave, saying that it was the custom to tie on hell shoes so that the dead can wear them on their journey to Valhalla. So while a journey is suggested in some cases, there's other cases where it's very clear that precautions were taken so that the dead couldn't go anywhere. So an example of that, the Óskarson ship is moored to a huge boulder by a large cable when it was found. And another example of Gisla saga, when Gisli was burying another brother-in-law, he dropped a huge boulder on the man's body in his boat in the grave, presumably so he couldn't go anywhere. And in other cases, precautions were taken so that the dead man couldn't roam around as a ghost, as a droiger, which we'll talk about later in the presentation. So the burial practices give us a strong suggestion that the lines were not clear when it came to life or death, body and spirit. And then we come to this very strange practice. And this is a really good example of misinterpretation of archaeological data that we were talking about before. We find bones from Viking age burials that have marks in them, like this one indicated by the arrow. And for decades, these have been interpreted as marks left by the weapon. So this is a leg bone, and it's been interpreted as a sword passed all the way through the leg, hit the leg bone, and made a mark on it. But more recent evidence has caused these to be reinterpreted. Now, there is good evidence that at least some Viking burials, the body was buried, then dug back up, then reburied, then dug back up multiple times within about a generation. So instead of being weapon marks, these are now being interpreted as careless shovel marks when the body was being disinterred. And we have no idea why this was done, but one suggestion, you know, feasts, celebrations were held to celebrate recently departed family members. Perhaps the body was brought back up for the feast so it could attend the feast. So dead, but not dead. And we simply do not know. Reynir.
Yeah. So, yeah, as you can see, as William mentioned, journey, travel, dead but not dead. And we will see this aspect as well when we think about what happens to the so-called spirit after death. When a Viking died, there were many places you could go to for the spirit to go to. You could go to Valhalla, where the slain warriors chosen by Óðinn go. The Valkyrias go down and collect them and ride them all the way to Valhalla. And Valhöll means Hall of the Slain. And there they would become einherjar, the elite force of Óðinn, who would fight it every day. There they might die, but reanimate again to attend the feast at the evening, drinking meat and eating flesh. And these people will join the army of the gods at the final battle at the Ragnarök. Again, they die, then they go somewhere else and die again and die again and die again. Now the slain could also go to Fólksvangr, which is Freyja's field. More we do not know about this realm because the sources are quite silent. Those who die at sea, they would go to Rán in her realm. Rán is the goddess of the sea. She would capture the men in her net. And if a man died at sea and attended his own funeral service, so he would be dripping wet in his own clothes, but attending his funeral service, then it was known that Rán received him well. And even people brought on board ships with them golden rings, so they could bribe Rán to receive them well if they enter her realm. So we're seeing left and right dead, but somehow not fully dead. The body is still somehow intact. The clothes get red and so on. Those who are old and sick and others usually go to hell. And the English Christian word for hell is derived from the Old Norse word hel, though these two places are vastly different. Hel is a place for the dead. Hell is a place of torment. Hel is cold. Hell is warm. So though the name is derived, it's not the same. Now, Hel is both the name of the place and the ruler of the location. It's not such a place of torment. Now, I am going to tell you one of the myths, the short version, because it's a good reference point that we come to again and again in this lecture. And it is about the death of Baldur, the most beloved and best god. He is the son of Frigg and Óðinn. And the tale goes like this, the myth goes like this. Baldur had nightmares, and the gods could not decipher what these nightmares meant. So Óðinn went to the land of the dead. There he raised up a vulva from dead, a seeress, to interpret the dreams. And she told them secrets about the past, the present, the future. And she even told them what the dreams meant, that Baldur would die. And she even named who would avenge him. So Frigg, his mother, got every living and dead item, every animate and inanimate being to promise that they would not harm Baldur. And long story short, everything did except the mistletoe. So Loki, the trickster god, got Höður, the blind god, to shoot a missile off a mistletoe into Baldur, killing him. And this was a terrible thing for the gods. And Óðinn knew what it meant eventually. So he said this was the worst thing that happened to the gods. So Baldur is put on a funeral pyre, and his wife Nanna dies of grief and jumps on and is put on the funeral pyre as well. They both go to Hel. Frigg, Baldur's mother, asks Hermóður to ride down to Hel to bargain to bring Baldur back. And again, long story short, the deal didn't go through, and Baldur is still in Hel. So there are so many interesting things in this myth that we'll go back to, but you can see clearly here the element of dead but not dead, and you can go and bargain for the being. And even after Ragnarök, Baldur will return. So there are many things that we'll come back to. Now, Hel is a special place because you can die there, and you can die to go to another place. So you die in the living life, you die in Hel, and there you go to a place called Niflhel. And according to one source, the people in Hel will also become pawns in this final war, the Ragnarök, where they will become Heljarsinnar. They will fight alongside the giants aboard Naglfar, which is made from the nails of dead men. But not everybody left Midgarður, the realm of humans. Some people stayed there. They became a draugur, a ghost, a physical ghost. And these were usually evil entities. They had died and they were just evil in life and returned as that, or they had a grudge to bear, or there was magic involved. For whatever reason, they came back and are now roaming. These were not nice figures. They had immense strength and crushed humans or tore their skin off. They made animals insane, or they just wreaked havoc in towns. They were something that had to be dealt with. And there are numerous ways to deal with them, both in the later folklore and some of the sagas. You had poetry that could, like power poetry, they could bring it down, magic staves, herbs. But the surest and safest way to secure yourself against the ghost is glíma, which is the national sport of Iceland. Now, glíma is the empty-handed fighting system of the Vikings as well, and the only sport really that survived from the Viking age till today. And please don't look up on the internet glíma, because most of what is there is nonsense. You can see a site for the Glíma Association of Iceland, glima.is. Now, you could also decapitate the ghost if you had the tool available, the weapon available. And if you did that, you would take the head and place it behind the bottom of the ghost and walk between to confuse the ghost. And we'll see this confusion in a minute. Now, there are many precautions taken so a dead body wouldn't become a ghost or wouldn't become a menace as a ghost. The eyes and nostrils were closed, a bag was placed over the head, or even a wall in the house was broken and the dead body carried out and the wall built against, so the ghost wouldn't know his way in. There are the other aspect of this staying in Midgard, the home of the humans, is to become a mound dweller, a haupbúi. And haupbúi are not roaming free like the draugur. They are content in their mound. They stay in their mound, and they could be something to deal with, like on some mounds there's a mound fire indicating there's a treasure there. So the hero would go inside the mound, try to steal something, like Grettir stole his sacks from a mound, and he had to fight off Kárin Gamli to get that sacks. But in other cases, you can hear sounds of festivities and joy from the mounds. People are just content to be in there. Now, there are other beings as well that are connected to this death, but not death, such as Gullveig. She was killed 3 times and burned, but always she returns. Or the idea that Óðinn could make a dead man's tongue speak. Or Óðinn again with the head of Mimir. Now, Mimir was the wisest of the gods, but he was killed in the first war between the Æsir and Vanir and decapitated. And now Óðinn raised his head up and put herbs so it wouldn't rot. So he could tell them advice and suggestions. So again, they're really physical, and this death, not death, it seems like life and death has many shades of gray. And the separation of body and spirit is in no way clear. Am I missing something, William?
I don't think so. So I'll take over. We've talked about the heathen beliefs. What did Christians believe in the Viking Age? Now, as I said earlier, most Vikings were heathens, but some of them took the first steps towards accepting Christianity that would allow them to trade with Christian merchants in their travels. And Christianity was adopted in some Viking lands during the Viking Age, although in the example of Sweden, that didn't happen until nearly the very end of the Viking Age. Regardless, some Vikings were Christians. So how did that change things with their treatment of the dead? And the simple answer is, it's hard to tell. In places where we have the best sources, such as Iceland, what the sources tell us is that few things actually changed. Heathen practices were allowed to continue for a long, long time. But the conversion in Iceland is unusual in many ways. But one aspect that did change virtually overnight is burial practices. Bodies were buried in the churchyard rather than at the edge of the farm once Christianity was adopted. And bodies were buried without grave goods. It seems that Christian bodies weren't going anywhere. No journey was envisioned for the body. And another aspect that is worth noting is that the orientation of the bodies was different in the graves. Typically, Christians were buried facing east-west, whereas heathen graves were typically north-south. And so when you go to these old churchyards, the heathen graves really stand out because they're oriented in the wrong direction. So all the Christian graves here are all oriented north-south, but this heathen grave is oriented east. I'm sorry, is all the Christian graves are east-west, and this heathen grave is north-south. Reynir, did I miss something?
No, you never miss anything. Not a beat. So there are other concepts involved in this, in understanding the Viking contemplation of death and life and afterlife and everything. One of it is something called örlög. It's best translated as fate or destiny. Now, every being's death was predetermined by the Nornir. So the Nornir would visit you at the day of your birth and decide the day of your death. And there was nothing you could do when it was your day to die, and there was nothing that could be done when it was not your day to die. And we see that people could get a glimpse of their fate. Be that Baldur with his dream, like I mentioned before, which is mentioned numerous times in the literary sources, where somebody has a dream, or seeing their own fylgja, which is a familiar animal, that means death was nearing, or seeing some other sign like a weapon turning bloody without reason. And even the gods were slaves to the destiny. Ragnarök, the final war, it literally translates destiny of the gods. And as you could see with the Baldur tale I told you before, they are really slaves to destiny. Did I miss anything, William?
No, I don't think so. So what I'd like to mention a little bit is, if a Viking thought that death was imminent, what did he do? What did he or she do to prepare? So many religions have a ritual along the lines of, oh, please God, save me from death. For example, a Christian today might pray, or some people might carry an amulet, like a St. Christopher's medal, or a Viking Age Christian might pray to the holy King Olafur. What did heathen Vikings do when facing danger or death? And the simple answer is, it doesn't seem like they did anything. It seems that death was not something gravely important to these people. The literary sources are filled with examples of this, where a warrior who is about to die performs one more feat, speaks one more line, something that diminishes the reputation of his killer, and something that will cause his death to be remembered, something that makes his death more heroic, more memorable. So for instance, a man who is mortally wounded in a battle turns to the strongest fighter on the other side for the death blow. So his death will be remembered as being honorable. Or a man who is about to be beheaded, who has long, beautiful hair. He asks that his hair be held back out of the way so it doesn't get bloody. So in and around the moment of death, these people thought that there was something more important than that death. Reynir?
So what could be more important than life and death? That is eternal life, immortality. And I'll give you the quote from Háamór, the best, most often quoted and most famous quoted. First in Icelandic. Þeir fé, þeir frændur, þeir sjálfur þið sama, en orðstírr þeir aldrei, þeim sér góðan getur. So simply it says, your cattle will die, your kinsmen will die, you yourself will die. But someone who has a good orðstírr will never die. So what is this orðstírr? What is this eternal life, immortality? Orðstírr literally means word glory. It is what people talk about you after your death. What people say about you after your death. So then the question is, well, what makes it good? How do you attain this orðstírr and how do you make it good? And then we have to introduce new concepts. The first one is drengur. Now, this is a rune stone raised in the memory of a smiður, a man called Smiður, and he was said to be a drengur. So what does drengur mean? Drengur means a man or woman that is to be trusted, that can be trusted. And trust is the highest idea, highest trait in a violent world. A man you can trust is somebody you want with you on raid. He will tell you of an ambush. He will fight to the bitter end next to you. He will never stab you in the back. He is a man to be trusted. But this goes with business as well. A man who trades fairly is a drengur. So in the Scandinavian languages, the word drengur changed. I think in Norwegian, and please correct me if it's wrong, that drang means like farmhand. And in Icelandic, drengur means young boy. But yet the same, even though the word has evolved, it still keeps its element here in Iceland, because in a legal setting in court, if you refuse to swear on the Bible, they offer you to swear on your drengskapur, your sense of honor and trust. And glíma, the national sport of Iceland, is all about drengskapur. It is about sportsmanlike behavior, somebody you can trust to behave correctly. Am I missing something, William?
No.
No. Now you can see this clearly in the oath ring. So this is an oath ring where people would swear an oath on. They would redden the ring with the blood of a cattle and swear an oath. And it is still used today in modern heathenry, where around marriages and such. Now, those who would break an oath, they would become a nýðingur. A nýðingur is not the opposite of drengur, but very close enough. A nýðingur is the lowest of the low, the vilest of the vile. Even in modern today's Icelandic, we use nýðingur for those who harm children or animals. So still the same, it is really hard. It is not identically the same, because it could be used as a curse. Somebody could say it to you in poetry, or in effigies, or even in nýðstöng. And yeah, this is a nýðstöng, a scorn pole, a shame pole. It was raised, this is the most famous one is from Eilsaga, where he raises it towards the land spirits against the king and queen of Norway. And you might think, oh, this doesn't affect me, this is all ancient news, but this is the latest one from 2022 here in Iceland. So last year, so we're still doing it. Now, there are many other aspects associated with this. It's not just Orðstírr, drengur, and nýðingur. There are other aspects such as virðing, a man's worth, sæmd, sort of prestige, frami, we could say fame. You'll just have to buy our book, Man of Terror, to understand all these words. It's too long to go into it all here. I apologize. So, I like to give examples. So I will give you an example of how we can clearly see the essence of us all, and we can really see the essence of it all in the dueling practices of the Vikings. Now, let's say the evildoer William challenges me to a duel, and if I don't accept, I am not a drengur. I can't be trusted. But if I accept, I will have to show up, because it is made clear that if I don't show up, I'm a nýðingur, and my value in society will diminish intently. Even in Hegningalag, I think they state this, the Swedish laws. So I have to show up to not be a nýðingur and to be a drengur. Now, the dueling laws are really unique in the Viking lands. They were round-based and they were immobile. So William would set up, and I would set up, and I take the first round, then his round, and then my round. And if I move, I'm not a drengur. I can't be trusted. I am a nýðingur. So I must fight to the bitter end as courageously as I humanly can. So this is what it's about. It's about Orðstírr, about being remembered, about being talked about in the best way, as in I was trusted. We can see it as So we could see it in the fighting practices as well. So if that evil troll William would attack me, and I would kill him by backing away and sort of snapping a strike at him, nobody would talk about that. But if I would cleave the evil troll William in two with my battle axe, then people would say, do you remember when Reynir, he really cleaved William in two? Am I missing something, William?
No. So today we might think that life and death and the gods are the most important aspect of existence, but to a man or a woman of the Viking age, it was different. The dividing line, as we've seen multiple times here, the dividing line between life and death was gray and fuzzy. So as an example, Baldur died and went to hell to live. Hermodr was sent to try to bring him back to the land of the living. And Baldur will survive and survive Ragnarok and be one of the few who does. So he is dead, but he is alive with a physical presence. And then there's dead people in the land of the living, such as ghosts, Dörgur. And what was far more important than life or death of the Viking was Orðstírr. And we clearly see that in Havamal, the words of Óðinn. So one lived one's life trying to achieve Orðstírr by being a drinker. And we see clearly that Freyja achieved Orðstírr by his memorial stone. Here it is 1,000 years after his death, and we're still speaking his name and talking about his accomplishments. And the life goal of a Viking was to attain and build up his Orðstírr. Orðstírr was commonly achieved through combat, but combat was not about life or death. Combat was about achieving Orðstírr, something far more important than life or death. So a Viking was much less concerned about life or death and what came after death than we are today. So it was a society eager and ready for battle in order to achieve Orðstírr and eternal life. So I'd like to finish up with just a few additional words. We've been talking about many, many things in this presentation: life and death, Orðstírr, Drengur, and much more. And if you'd like to learn more, as Reynir said, we encourage you to read our book. This may sound a little bit like an advertisement, but there's a lot in there, much more than we can say in a short presentation like this. But more importantly than that, today we've been talking about Vikings. And for those of you who are listening, I think you understand that we did our part, giving Vikings their eternal life, their Orðstírr, by continuing to talk about them today. And for you, as members of this genealogical society, this may be more important than to other people. We are giving our words to help keep your ancient ancestors alive. And we hope that you will continue to do the same, to talk about your ancestors and their deeds, to find out about them, to give them their eternal life, their Orðstírr, the eternal life of the Viking people. So at this point, we thank you and we open it up to questions. And I think Kurt will be relaying those to us.
So those of you, okay, we have a question here. Beth Erickson. Bob, do you want to get a mic to Beth, maybe? Okay.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We're here in Minnesota and land of the Vikings. I don't know if it has anything to do with this or not being a football fan. On a recent podcast I listened to, they talked about the role of women, female Vikings, and there was an intricate process for a woman to become a landowner. But they did have a fairly large political role, especially in the travel of the Vikings and, in other lands. But I don't remember them mentioning the role of women as Viking warriors. So were there any women Viking warriors, and are there examples of that?
Reynir, would you like to take this?
I'm being thrown under the bus. I will tell you what our research has led to. The short answer is sort of not. If you want to look for, how should I put it? If you mentioned the UFO analogy again before, and we found one fragment of one UFO in one place, then we wouldn't say, well, the world is filled with UFOs. So a woman might have been a warrior, but the sources about it are immensely limited. Brilliant.
And I would add to that, we just have so many sources that point away from that, such as law codes. For instance, the law code says that it was not permissible for a woman to carry a weapon, as an example, and so many additional sources that point away from women routinely being warriors. I will add to this that everyone, men, women, children, did what they needed to do to survive in the Viking Age. So if there was a threat, then of course a woman would pick up a weapon and use it. And we see in the literary sources that they seem to be very competent at this. And if there was no weapon available, they would use glima. They would use grappling to take the man down and kill him. And they were competent at this. So again, we don't know. The sources point away from women routinely being warriors.
I have a few questions online.
Yes, please.
The first one is a plug. What's the name of your book?
The book is Men of Terror. Men of Terror, a comprehensive analysis of Viking combat. And you can buy this at your favorite bookstore, Amazon, whatever you like.
The second question from Cheryl is sort of related. How did Viking women achieve Orðstírr?
You want me to take that, William?
Sure, sure.
We have women who did, who were something to be trusted, who did something interesting, who went beyond what you would expect other people, like the traveler, the Djúpur, right?
Yes.
And so on. So you could attain it, or yeah, the name is I lost the name, sorry, but in the East Fjords there was one who was really wealthy, and she attained Orðstírr by that, by apparently being fair and wealthy. So there are a million ways up Mount Fuji, but only one top, that is Orðstírr.
And there's not much I can really add to that. You achieved Orðstírr by doing something unusual, something that showed your trustworthiness, that you could be counted upon in some future activity. And that applied both to men and women. And it was simply a way to achieve Orðstírr.
Sorry for adding a little bit.
Please.
You try to put yourself in physical danger. Now you could do that by traveling abroad. So if you push your boundaries on your travels, like those who went to America, then you would be still spoken about today, like we do with Óðinn.
Okay, and one more from Denise. Says, if death was not overly important to the Vikings, why did Freyja go to such lengths to protect Valhöll and keep him alive and safe?
Can I, William?
Yes, please.
So there are a few ways to answer this. Number one, to me, my theory is he is the first sign of the impending Ragnarök, the destiny of the gods, where everything will die and everything will change. Number two, he was just so loved, just so cherished. Oh, no, sorry, what was the answer?
So back to the women warriors, I've done quite a bit of reading, or a fair amount of reading about BJ 581 at Birka. the woman that was found in that grave. Do you have any, what are your thoughts on that? As a woman, was she a woman warrior or an outlier, or she wasn't, or what do you think? Or do you have any thoughts?
Can I try, Reynir, and then you?
Please.
Okay. So this grave at Birka has been much written about, both in the academic press and popular press. There's been a lot of discussion of it. And at the moment, to us at least, it falls into the category of an outlier. There's insufficient evidence to figure out what's going on. So a quick summary, if you're not familiar with the grave, Birka was excavated starting when? In the 19th century, I think. And it was, even though it was early in the science of archaeology, it was well done. And this particular grave was clearly a very rich warrior's grave, filled with weapons. And importantly, the location of the grave in the graveyard shows that it was someone very important. Now, fast forward to the 21st century, the bones that were excavated from this grave were studied, and they were shown to be the bones of a woman. And there were some conclusions drawn that in popular articles that probably are a little tenuous. Probably that's the best way to put it. We simply do not know. There's a grave, clearly a warrior, filled with warriors' things. Was this woman that was buried in that grave, was she the warrior? We don't even know that. So for instance, a warrior, we might be able to tell something from the skeletal remains, but the bones are too poorly preserved to look for things like battle injuries or for the strength of the skeleton or anything like that. So we simply do not know who this person is that's buried in this grave. And added to that, we have all these sources that point against women routinely being warriors. So we simply do not know. So the grave is absolutely fascinating. It cannot be ignored. But right now, there's not enough evidence to make some of the conclusions that have been made in popular articles. And I would go even more further out on the limb and say, there's not enough evidence to support some of the things that are in some of the scholarly articles as well. So right now, I think my own personal opinion is let's hold back till we have more information, because right now we don't know enough.
I'll add to it a little bit before we get more questions about the same topic.
Yeah.
This is the hot topic of the day. And as I mentioned numerous times in this lecture, we need to put our modern mindset away. We need to not try to make Vikings us. If we want Vikings to be this or this, we need to just look at what is. And if we saw, what should I say? If we saw a Rembrandt painting in Africa, it doesn't mean it's African, or it doesn't mean that everybody in Africa had a Rembrandt. It just means this one. It might be an outlier. So again, it is a hot topic and it is a minefield. You have no idea how much scolding we get, whatever we say, and this is not our specialty.
I have a question here from Paul Jackson.
Hi, thanks for your presentation today. I'm interested in this aspect of the grayness between life and death. People left on voyages on these ships, and many of them did not ever come back, and nobody had any clue of what happened to them. Some of them went away. One in particular I'm thinking of is Harold Hardrada, who went to the Black Sea, and he came back later and decades later and just stepped into his old life. It's kind of like when you go away on a trip like this, it's kind of like Schrodinger's cat. Are they living or are they dead? And you won't know unless somebody comes back, like Hardrada did, or somebody is successful on their voyage. How does this relate, or this gray area, how does the living and dead relate to that? People who may come back or may never come back?
If I may, Reynir, I'll start and then you can finish. Thank you, Paul. It's an interesting observation, and I think it's spot on. People went on these voyages, and because they were so risky, there's no clear belief that they would likely come back. But one way that someone who stayed home might get an inkling about the fate of the person that was away would be through some of these supernatural signs, through dreams or through visions, or perhaps the dead person actually comes back. But beyond something like that, there would be no way to tell. Reynir?
No, I have nothing to add. You answered it well.
Okay, I have a question. 25 years ago, there was a traveling Vikings exhibit that went all over the place around the world, and we had it here in St. Paul for a number of months. And in it, they had an Edda, a book that they had to get the legislature in Iceland to approve the fact that it even left the country. I'm wondering if you know which book that was, what was a part of that exhibit.
Okay, I simply do not know. I'm sorry. It's very possible that the manuscript I showed the picture of traveled. It is very precious. It's an amazing artifact. And it's possible that it traveled. I simply do not know. There are other, as I said, there's two separate books that are called Edda, and I do not know which of the two traveled. The prose Edda has a lot more manuscripts that have survived, but the poetic Edda really has only that one. And it is possible that it traveled. I just don't know.
I remember that this one was not very large.
Yes.
And that the writing was incredibly tiny. Are they all that way?
So the manuscripts vary all over the map. One thing we didn't get into is the literary society, the literary works of the Vikings. And the manuscripts are amazing. There's no question about it. They vary quite a bit. Some are large, fancy, illuminated books in multiple colors, and some are very plain, like the poetic Edda is quite small and nothing went to waste. It's important to remember how expensive these books were to create, because they were made of calf skin. So in order to make a book, you had to kill a lot of calves. And one cow might be the difference between living and starving to death during a harsh winter. So to sacrifice hundreds of calves to make a book, that's a huge, huge investment. So the books were very, very precious in the Viking Age. And then on top of that, there was the labor of actually writing out the book. So both of those were added to the value of the book. So when they created the book, of course, they wanted to use as few calves as possible. So they wrote small. Some of them are small. Some of them are quite large. And, I have seen the manuscript for the Poetic Edda a couple of times, and I would not call it small. The book is small, but the writing is not. It's really quite legible. But some of the books are really like pocketbooks. They're small books that would fit in some sort of small pouch or something like that you would carry around with you. One that I've looked at was a law book, probably carried by a lawman to the think meeting, and a reminder of the laws. So the manuscripts varied all over, and some are huge with very elaborate illustrations. Reynir.
Oh,
No, you answered it perfectly.
I have a question. I was curious if you've seen the movie The Northman, which I think came out last year, and it's set in the Viking Age about a Viking warrior. Would you say that movie is at all accurate or a good depiction of this age and culture and mindset?
Reynir.
So we have a sort of saying that we decided upon when it came to all entertainment. Good entertainment does not mean a good history lesson, and a good history lesson is usually not good entertainment. So yeah, that I'll have to end there. I mean, there are many really interesting things, and especially to an Icelander, seriously interesting. A lot of depth to some things, but good entertainment will never be a good history lesson. That is my theory, at least.
Nothing I can add to that.
So thanks again for your presentation. I'm, in my mind, I'm thinking all these, this information originally comes from oral traditions from now Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, what was that, Greenland? Have you had a chance to see similarities or differences as they've come through the ages? You know, did the Swedish Vikings behave like the Vikings that settled Iceland, etc.? Thank you.
I'll try. Yeah, I'll try. One thing that is clear from the evidence is that, and I will modify this in a bit, but one thing that seems clear is the uniformity amongst the Viking lands in terms of language, in terms of beliefs, and so on. These people traveled extensively. They communicated with one another extensively. And so there do not seem to be huge differences from one Viking land to another during the Viking Age. Now, that doesn't mean that there were no differences. It seems, for instance, there were some differences in religious practices. Which gods were most beloved seem to be very different in some lands than in other lands. And we see that from place name evidence, you know, places that were named after the gods. And there were differences in language. Now, throughout the Viking Age, the language started to drift and mutate. And by the end of the Viking Age, there seemed to be like an Eastern Norse dialect and a Western Norse dialect. Both seemed to be understandable one to the other, but there were changes already starting to form. But the important thing is the Viking people were traveling people, and so they met and interacted frequently. So I think there were more things alike than there were things that were different. Reynir?
Yeah, I'll add, but just a tiny bit. It was such a good answer. What we look for is the holistic image. That is our goal. We don't look for what makes this group different than this. If we check if there's enough similar, but sometimes it is impossible to look past what is different. And our main focus of research is Viking combat, and we see that in Iceland compared to other lands, and we see that mostly via big battles. Icelanders didn't do big battles, like mass battles. And archery was not their thing. We see that because archery was a king sport and Icelanders didn't have a king. Archery was used in large-scale battles and Icelanders didn't have large-scale battles. Aside from that, they didn't have the wood to make a bow. Aside from that, they didn't have anything to hunt with a bow, which wasn't easier to catch with a snare or something of those lines.
A couple more online questions. Do we have time?
Yes, please.
Okay, one, Anne asks, what are the rules of Glima?
Reynir.
Yeah, I think I'll have to answer that. I love when the question is something Glima. It makes my heart warmer and thaws the ice. So what are the rules of Glima? It is unfair to say it's simply a wrestling sport because it is very unique. And the Glima evolved into what we know it is now. So it has a direct lineage to what we know now. We can see where the changes were and so on. We still use in modern day Glima the old rules from Grágás, from the oldest law book in Iceland. What was it, 12 something written down?
It was probably first written down in the 12th century. So even before then.
And that's where they mentioned a fall is if it hits below, no, sorry, above the knee or above the elbow. And that is still competed with that today. Usually the competitions of old were like competing in 3, but that could change as well. So just imagine a wrestling sport where you can sort of half fall and you're not still considered falling. But you'll just have to check out glima.is and see more, or just contact us directly or buy the book or something.
Yeah.
Interested in Glima.
And I will add to that, please feel free to contact us. The email is on the handout that is available to you, and we're happy to discuss this further, answer your questions, what have you.
And the last question online, but one, is referring to the Birka grave. That could she be part of the grave goods, where wives, mistresses, slaves, servants, etc., buried with the main person who was buried?
I'll try to answer it. The direct answer to the question, could she be grave goods? I have no idea. I have no evidence for or against. Was it done? Yes. The example of Baldur, for instance, his wife was so grief-stricken that she entered the ship. She died from grief and was laid in the ship. That's certainly possible in other cases as well. But whether the woman in the grave at Birka is grave goods or something else, or a wife or something else, I have no idea.
Okay, there's also, Cheryl asks, how are axes used in combat or personal issues?
Yeah, I'll give it a go. I will try to answer it simply, but we should start an advertisement agency or something with them, so we always don't have to repeat ourselves by the book. It's better instructed there. In the most simple way, we explained to you a lot about the mindset of the Viking, how they thought, and that's how they behave in combat. And we have also 2 other pillars of understanding Viking combat. Number 1 is mindset, which we have discussed. Number 2 is this aspect of glima, this power aspect. And number 3 is adaptability, best seen in the use of rocks. Now, if you understand how they thought, that is about Orðstírr, and I would give you an axe, and I would teach you how to fight in a strong way without having ever touched an axe. You would know how to use it. You would just cleave what was in front of you. You want your name known. You want to destroy what was in front of you in the most powerful fashion, the most noteworthy fashion possible. And but still, in the same way, you wanted to be a drengur, a man to be trusted. William?
The only thing I would add to that is an axe is ideally suited for its use. It is something that cleaves into whatever it hits. One of our research projects is the physics of weapons, and it is really clear that axes excel at that. They split into whatever it is they hit.
Do we have any other questions, either here or on Zoom?
Simply a Zoom comment that I think expresses our common feelings here. What a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. I'll be looking for the book now to learn more. So appreciative.
Well, thank you.
I love questions like this.
Yeah.
Learn questions of praise. Those are my favorite. You can bring one if you like.
Thank you, William and Reynir. We enjoyed your presentation. Really appreciate your doing this remotely, and that really helps everybody out. This room has another meeting at 1, so we've got a fair amount of time. I thought we might be a little more rushed, but of all groups, the Norwegians are having a meeting here, so. So we're being very Scandinavian oriented today as a group here. And we do have, for those of you that might need it for research or something, we do have the founders conference room in the back in the corner. If there's somebody that wants to get research help and you don't do it in the library, that is available just for our researchers, know that. And you can use the library here. If you do go into the library, they're open till 4. They do request that you log in at the front desk if you do go into the library. And so you can linger here in the room for a little bit. You know, we'll keep an eye out for the Norwegians. I'm not sure how much time they need to set up. That's the only issue, is that we want to be respectful of their setup time, because we know we like to have our buffer time ahead of time. And Paul, did you have something? Okay.
I'm interested in Harold Hardrada. I'm hoping that I'll be able to put him in my family tree. He was killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in England. Are you familiar with this? Would you be able to speak about this? I'm wondering what the hell happened. He just won a great battle, and they say that he put his armor and his heavy weapons back on the ships, and he wasn't, and they were partying, and King Harold of England came and they defeated him. That's the first question. And the second question is, what if Harold Hardrada had won the Norman, what's his name? The Norman the Conqueror William the Conqueror landed 2 days later in southern England. And if Harold had won up in northern England, they would have met eventually, and who would have won that?
Okay, I'll try to answer. So the Battle of Stamford Bridge is described in quite a bit of detail in the literary sources, Heimskringla for one, so that would be a good place to start. And in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, if I'm not mistaken, also has material on it. So exactly what happened, I'm not sure that I could add any more to what those original sources have to say about it. What could be done differently? I do not know. The armor probably didn't play that big a role, to be honest. Not very many people, our research suggests that not very many people had armor. And in fact, the king, when he was seen to be unarmored, at least one person offered his own armor to the king, and the king declined it. So it's not like the king thought he was at a disadvantage by not being armored. Had he won the battle, how would he done facing William? Again, no idea. I can't really speculate. Reynir?
Yeah, just support your answer, William. Speculation is not not something we do. We're nerdy scientists.
The berserkers that so this is 50 years ago or whatever, that when Vikings were in combat and they became just concentrated on winning their battles, that's all they looked to, which now I hear some of the Orðstírr coming through. Is that just a made-up term from entertainment, the berserkers?
I'll answer. So no, clearly not made up. What they were, we are not 100% sure, but we can see that in the old Icelandic logbook that I was talking about, they forbid that men go berserks or ganga berserksgang. And in the sagas and the literary sources, we see berserkers happen, both the rage itself and this idea of some human beings being berserker That happens a few times. But what they are, we cannot be 100% sure. It seems like they took on the animal spirits, and be that like berserk, like the bearskin, or berserk half naked. They howled like wolves. They bit their shields. So as crazy as they were, they at least carried shields. This is the standard operating procedure: howling like a dog or wolf and biting the shield. And you could even see it in the Lewis chessmen. Maybe William, you'll talk more about this. But we have a section on berserkers in our book. So more so than other things. I would guess they are not Hollywood fake. At least it's really old Hollywood fake.
So the one thing I would add is the berserks were also important troops for the kings. For instance, in a ship battle, the king would put his berserks at the very front of the ship where the fiercest fighting was. Number two to his hearth, his bodyguards. They were number one, the berserks were number two in terms of fighting strength. So there just seems to be a fair amount of evidence that this was something real in the Viking Age.
Well, thank you, William and Reynir. That
Yep.
was an incredible presentation, and I don't know where else we would have learned this kind of stuff. So thank you so much. I would just like to tell you about some of the other programs coming up. I don't know that they're going to top this one, but they'll probably be pretty good. In March, on the 25th, we will have Janet Johnson talking about finding your immigrant's place of origin. It's one of the tougher things that some of us face, is trying to figure out exactly where they came from in Sweden. And once you find that place, then you have this wealth of records that open up to you to continue your research. Wayne already talked about the 40th anniversary. It's not a wedding anniversary. It's it's the 40th anniversary of the Swedish Genealogical Society of Minnesota. On April 22nd at the American Swedish Institute, there will be entertainment by Ross Sutter and Art Bjorngeld, and a smorgasbord menu. Listen to this: pickled cucumber salad, pickled beet salad, bread and butter, Swedish meatballs with lingonberries, salmon with dill beurre blanc, mashed potatoes, coffee and water, Swedish cookies, and princess tort cake. Am I making you hungry? On May 27th, we will have a presentation by Jill Seaholm, who is the head of genealogical services at the Swenson Library in Augustana, Illinois, at Augustana College in Illinois. And she'll be talking about what the resources they have, what resources they have available for us at the Swenson Swedish Immigration Research Center. And October 14th is our fall conference, and Ingela Holland will be giving 2 sessions about the history of the Swedish language. And Jeff Jensen, who is the archivist at Gustavus Adolphus College, will be talking about what is available in that archive for research. And don't forget about our monthly fikas, the last Sunday of each month from 2 o'clock to 3:15. It's virtual, so it's easy for you to attend. And the one tomorrow, I'll be just leading a discussion about preserving photographs. So I invite you to come to those 2. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz. I'm remiss for in the first part of not mentioning this, but Virginia Taylor has not gone away. Okay. Virginia, yes, Virginia continues on. I heard somebody say, oh, Virginia's gone. Virginia's not gone. She's still very active. She's a past president, and so she doesn't have to run for re-election anymore. She won 12 times, so she gets a pass. So you know, Virginia is still very active and supportive of the group. So we really appreciate that. I'm going to put in a mug here, or a mug. Yes, I'm going to put in a plug for our mug. I don't know how well it shows up. It's not really light here, but and these are on sale at the book sales table for $15. So that's one side of it, and the other side has our name. Kind of hard to see with the reflection. Is that backwards for you guys, or is it just okay? It looks backwards to me. The writing looks backwards, like when you look in your rear view mirror. So yeah, so those are available and good sturdy mug. How many people here want research help today? One. Okay, there's one person. And your name is? Okay, Jack. And then, so we've got researchers, probably have you outnumbered. How many researchers raise your hands that are going to help? So why don't you meet with Jack and see, who might, who or maybe more than one might be a good fit for him today, and you can help him, help him through that. Again, take advantage of the library. Are there any questions, last minute questions, or anything anybody wants to mention or ask? Okay, come to. Yes. So thank you, William and Reynir. I'll get it right yet.
I have a question, Wayne, if it's
Yes.
okay.
Yes.
And it'll be a question like the praise like we got before. That was not a question. I like that. Don't be afraid to contact us. Check us out. Ask us questions. We really want to work with people. We don't know all the answers, but we love to research and discover and find out together. So, thank you.
Thank you.
And this recording will be available on our website in the members area. So if you need to go back and review it, you feel free to do that. If you're a member, you'll be able to, we'll have it out there in a couple days. So, well, with that, we will call the meeting to an end, and thank you all for coming. And what's the word? Get set for all the cold weather, I guess. It sounds like we're going to get it coming back again. So thank you for coming, and appreciate you being here. And if you have questions of any of us after, just feel free to grab any one of us, and and we can talk about whatever you have going on. Thank you again.